that what we're seeing with the peaceful protests these days that are going into day 9 are a reflection of that. And how happy would your father be and those leaders of his generation and my aunts and uncles who participated in the civil rights generation be to see that we have so many people of all shapes and sizes and colors and nationalities who are marching together for the same thing. Sure, we had some of that, of course, in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but look at what that movement has turned into now. And that speaks to exactly what you're saying. You know, people saying no more to that, saying, no, there's time out for that, that's over, we got to do something different. So that is, I think that we are headed in the right direction. I think that we're kind of getting there slowly. So my next question is, a recent New York Times article said that George Floyd's death is a result of generational leadership failures because America failed to give African Americans economic and political power, which resulted in a lack of socioeconomic inclusion. I agree with that to an extent, but I think more important, or what the underlying or the root cause of those failures has always been race. What do you say?
No, I agree with you. I actually saw a very fascinating documentary about Ulysses S. Grant on the History Channel about a week ago. And it was interesting, the things that it revealed and brought out. Part of it is that the narrative after the Civil War to present day has been dominated by Southern writers from the various states that engaged in rebellion against the United States. So they've been allowed to characterize probably what is the most pivotal moment in time in the United States history. But in doing so, they have polluted that message. They have perverted that message. And they've actually perverted the characters who were on the field in the Civil War and Reconstruction times that were actually heroes. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, is painted as a butcher, right? He's painted as someone who sacrificed Union lives and Southern lives in bloodbath type of tactics to dominate the South as a butcher, to come in and butcher men. Not that he was crusading to keep the Union together from people who had rebelled against it. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, they have painted General Lee as a noble loyalist to his state, even though he held slaves, even though he betrayed the very government that had supported his military career his entire life. He's painted as this, almost reluctant warrior figure. And it is a cruel characterization to do to Grant because he won the Civil War. He was the person that basically put down the rebellion. And so we've allowed the losers of the fight to tell you about how the fight actually went down and turned out. Now, we know from the playground how that goes, that you got to, the loser is going to make his loss not seem so bad. Right. And not seem for what he was fighting for, not so awful. I mean, but it's in document after document after document. If you look at the reasons for secession from these Southern states, they all mention slavery as the cause. And so institutions and leadership descending from that time, they have let African Americans down because they have been also propagandized by the Southern mythology that this was a quote unquote lost cause. We know the lost cause was human bondage and built on human bondage and oppression. And so I encourage everybody, if you got the History Channel, to watch this documentary, because I learned so much about what U.S. Grant did for the United States, particularly when he became president. He won the Civil War, but then when he was his first term as president, he passed an anti-Ku Klux Klan law through Congress to go after the Ku Klux Klan, to prosecute them for terrorizing African Americans across the country, primarily in the South. But he did it, and the entire Congress, the Senate and the House, ratified it, and they jailed people who were in the Ku Klux Klan. So the first wave of the Ku Klux Klan, the first iteration of it in the United States, U.S. Grant put it down. He put down that terrorist organization. He was the person who basically began Reconstruction. And so when he was beginning the Reconstruction efforts to do the things that tragically we're still talking about now: economic empowerment, education, some level of reparations. I mean, even I learned from that documentary, and, you know, they kind of glossed over this in school, but the public education system, that was largely put forward by African-American legislators who had been elected to Congress, you know, from these former slave states, because they were looking out for their own. They knew that their people would never be able to be accepted in any private school. So you had to have a public education system. And so when Grant's terms were coming to the end, because of other side issues and controversies that weren't related to him personally, but were attached to his administration, he lost the political capital to continue Reconstruction. And the white North was growing impatient with the program, because they wanted to get back to business as usual, kind of like what's going on now with COVID-19. They don't want to deal with the problem. They just want to go back to how things are. And so you had that in the South, because, you know, the North paid a tremendous price in the loss of lives. I mean, even though the South lost a lot of lives, the North lost many, many, many more men. And so they didn't, when they were near the end of Grant's terms in office, you know, when there had been rebellions that broke out in cities or counties across the South, and even your old home state, Mississippi, appealed to General Grant to bring troops into Mississippi to put down these night riders and racists that were killing Black people. He admitted this as a mistake. He refused to send troops because he didn't think he no longer had the political mandate from his northern supporters to march troops into the South, because they didn't see it as saving African Americans, because remember, they still had an 1870s, 1880s view of African Americans as these folks are slaves, so they're still looking at them as lesser than 3/5 of a person. So they didn't want to sacrifice a white life to go and save a Black life after the Civil War. And so when Grant goes out of office, Reconstruction basically grinds to a halt. And that's when Jim Crow laws, the South begins to reassert itself and basically enforce, institutionalize, you know, what the great famous book, Slavery by Another Name, you know, the penal system, the indentured workers, you know, debtors, all this kind of thing, people working on behalf of the state to pay their debt to society, but basically was another form of institutionalized slavery. And so we got 100 years before Congress actually acts to rectify the problems that Grant had begun to solve, but no other political folks on the white side of the equation did anything substantially meaningful since U.S. Grant went out of office. And so we as African Americans owe a great deal of you know, appreciation to General Grant and for actually getting it done against the Ku Klux Klan and all these other things that he started. But most people don't know that. They just see him as they just see him as a hard drinking, you know, fighting butcher of men, when actually he's probably one of the greatest heroes that America and African Americans ever had. As a matter of fact, when he left office, and I'll shut this remembrance down, when he went around, he took a world tour with his wife when he retired. They had no pension, or anything for presidents then, but he took a world speaking tour, and no less than 100,000 people per city. Some crowds were as large as 250,000. It's reminiscent of Obama, right?
Wow.
That would come to see General Grant because they held him in such high esteem in that generation, just like Abraham Lincoln. But when that generation died out, that's when it was their children that really pushed Jim Crow and segregation and the further oppression of African Americans. Because they wanted to make it right for their grandparents,
Wow,
I was blown away, when I saw it.
Absolutely.
I'm blown away from hearing
it. I thought I knew a lot about
quite
history.
a lesson.
Yeah.
I
was blown away.
Oh, wow. I'm blown away from hearing it. So I want to turn to policing now. One strategy that is obviously missing in policing is community-oriented policing, which allows the police to build sound and trusting relationships with the community. From your perspective as a member of the Public Safety Committee, how does the City of Atlanta Police Department work towards that end?
Well, Atlanta is different than most police departments because of the culture in Atlanta. Community policing has been a concept that's been in Atlanta for a long time. And it has ebbed and flowed along with the amount of police that the city's been able to put on the street. Because what typically has happened when the numbers of police have been low in the city of Atlanta, it's hard for people to quote unquote community police because that's an investment in time for these officers. They have to, basically go door to door, either in the businesses or in the community, to build those relationships. And of course, that's not easily done. So if you have lower numbers in your police department where you're having trouble responding, let's say, to 911 calls, it's harder to let those officers go out and build those relationships. And so Atlanta has done that well and not so well over the last 20 or so years. Under Chief Harvard back in the 90s, it was a tremendous push to do community policing, even though we only probably had about 1,600 cops at the time. And it makes a substantial difference because people can put their hand on their local beat officer. They know that person. And it becomes a relationship, two-way street. So they can give up information that helps the community to the police, and then the police can share information with the community. Today, we have by comparison and in relationship to other departments, we have a very progressive police department. Chief Shields, she was mentored by Chief Turner, our former chief. They have been very positive in going out and trying to build relationships with the community. But and we got up to 2,000 officers probably about 3 years ago before Chief Turner left. So you had people that could work, you had more than one person working in a particular beat area. So you had people who could go out, go to the community meetings, meet with the community, go into business districts, and begin to build those relationships. And so I think Atlanta does better than most other places. But as we've seen, over this past weekend with the incidents with the two young college students, and in some other anecdotal cases where there have been some wrongdoing and there have been some killings by police that are still pending in the district attorney's office, Atlanta still has a long way to go. And I think it is a work in progress. I used to work in law enforcement for a short time, for about 4.5 years. And there is a definite culture there where it is resistant to change. And there's also a culture that people talk about the blue line. People on the blue side of the line want to protect each other because they feel victimized or mischaracterized. And then you've got bad apples everywhere. So you've got this confluence of issues in trying to build and make a better police department. But keeping to the tenets that they're supposed to protect and serve. It's the and serve part that has been left out. Okay. People go out and they'll protect property. If you call the police for help, they'll respond. But in service, you know, there's a lot of people, just like the case in DeKalb County where the Air Force veteran who had some mental issues was slain. You know, that wasn't a case, that was not a time to deal with a person in a violent manner. He wasn't threatening the individual. He was obviously mentally unstable because of the way his lack of dress and his behavior. That's when the service part is needed. That this individual, there has to be that sensitivity there to say this individual needs help. You know, they don't need a baton. They obviously don't need a bullet. They need some additional help. And if you as an individual officer don't feel equipped, you know, you've got a supervisor, you got other officers you can call. And so people need to get more in the service-minded end of that so that it does become a true asset to the community. You know, growing up here in Atlanta, I mean, and I remember the police department that we feared was the DeKalb County Police. You know, we knew that we didn't want to mess with the Atlanta police, but we knew if you went to DeKalb County, you had to walk a straight line. You know, when we were in high school, I had to have my tag. I couldn't have my lights on my bug, you know, messed up. No reason to get pulled over out there. You know, try not to be out there at night, you know. Try to get right on the highway, get right back downtown, you know, and all of that. But that's good. That's good and bad. You want people to have respect for the police, but having fear of people who are supposed to serve you is not correct.